Hi, I'm Kent.
And I'm Anna.
We're married, we make movies, and we believe that anyone in any circumstance can make a feature film.
Welcome to the Feature Filmmaker Podcast. If you want a career making movies, you're in the right place.
Hit subscribe to never miss an episode.
Let's jump right in.
Hi, welcome to this podcast episode. We're so glad that you are here. And today we want to talk a little bit about something that's been on my mind, sort of, and we just want to have a discussion about it. I think it's important because it's key in my mind to two things: making movies in general that are both personal and relatable and authentic. But I think it's also applies to making first features because we really believe in making films that are very producible. And that can be difficult because sometimes I think when we want to make films, it's hard for me sometimes when I sit down. The best ideas feel very expensive sometimes. And that can be kind of frustrating. And there's the old adage, write what you know. And that can also be frustrating sometimes, right? Sometimes it feels a little maybe on the nose or familiar, like there's nothing interesting about my life or about my story or about whatever. So we want to have a discussion about that this evening. We're gonna maybe do this a little bit more of a casual back and forth, and so I'll ask Anna some questions, and she might ask me some questions if she thinks of any. But we want to kind of take this in almost an interview fashion, and I'm going to interview Anna mostly about the films that she has worked on so far, especially the first feature that she directed and scripts that she's writing now. We won't get into super specifics about those movies, but just about her experience. And
Yes, this episode is directed by Kent.
okay, so the first question I have, Anna, there's this dichotomy of like, I guess, fantasy that feels like detached, like almost like a story that feels detached or impersonal. And then there's like autobiography, I guess, on the far extreme other side of that. I feel like you and I have always made films that are close enough that we worry that people will think that they're autobiography. Our first short that we co-directed and the feature that you directed, even films that you're writing right now, I think sometimes we worry like how much of this will be inspired by reality. In fact, am I putting too much reality in there that people are going to assume that these other things that maybe aren't reality? I guess my question is, do you approach that consciously? Do these ideas that maybe are more personal just come to you as like, it's a good idea, I want to explore it? Or is it like a conscious tactic? Like I'm going to mine my own personal brain or history. How do you approach that? Or do you even think about it?
Yeah, I think it's really essential to me to make whatever I'm making as personal as it can possibly be. And almost any story I can do that with if I have enough creative freedom. There might be certain stories where there just isn't enough freedom available for me to make it personal the way I'd want to. And I might say no to a project like that if I don't feel like I can take it that direction. But I think there's stories about all kinds of things and all kinds of genres that are personal to me. And really, it's just a thematic thing. I think it has less to do with the circumstances of the film, although because we started out with resource filmmaking, the circumstances tend to be very similar to our own because we're using our own house, our own children. Like it
Adds to the autobiographical feel of it.
it naturally leads to people saying, "Oh, is this about you? Like, is this a personal story?" And I can see why they would ask that. And it is, I do try to make it personal, but not about me. In fact, I think it's often kind of a philosophical exploration for me personally, where I want a character to represent maybe one side of an argument and other characters perhaps to represent another side, and explore how those two interact, how they clash, how they sometimes want the same thing. And a story is a really great place to explore that debate between things and find sort of a synthesis or a conclusion, or just let it play out all the way and see what happens.
Yeah, that's interesting. It does seem like it's like if we put these two characters into our lives, it sounds like you kind of are like insert these people that aren't us into our lives and just see what they do and play it out to the end. That's
Sometimes, yeah, I don't know if it's always into our lives. It's just
I never thought of it that way, but it's like kind of
with our first few films,
into our
it's
house with our
been
kids.
that way because that's we're using our resources.
Well,
So
and with the short Ready or Not, we also there was a baby that was belonged to us,
yeah.
that was featured in that particular film, and it was our friend's house, not ours. Um, but regardless, there were some issues there that were interesting. But and yet those characters were like extremely different than us. I think
Yeah.
like they didn't represent us.
No.
That's interesting. And so I feel like I think about the films that we loved, and I guess there are some that you particularly really love, and there's some that I really love, and they're not always the same. But I'll think of a few of your favorites.
Mhm.
Like, for example, La La Land is made by Damien Chazelle, who he's known for making pretty personal films. And yet, I think Whiplash is probably his most personal.
It might be his most autobiographical, but I do
Yeah,
feel like his films actually tend to explore similar themes and themes that I'm interested in, which tend to do with people who are trying to accomplish something that's a huge goal. Like they have goals that they want that are big.
Going to the Moon.
Yeah. And they're trying to do it. And it's always this question of, is it worth the sacrifice? Is it worth the sacrifices? And I mean, in his films, they always choose to do it despite everything they lose. And I think that there's some realism to that in that you can't have all the things you want necessarily in life. That would be sort of a fantasy or an unrealistic story. At the same time, it is something that I'm constantly thinking about because I don't want to sacrifice my relationships for film, but I do want to make a difference and I want to make films that I care about. And so there is sort of that question in my own mind of, you know, at what point is it too much? And how much success can you have without sacrificing those things? So it's a slightly different question, but I think what he's exploring is what does it take to have that level of success, to be the best at something,
What does it cost?
or to be the first on the moon, or to be, to have that dream you have wanted since you were a child come true. And then ultimately, is it worth it? And sometimes I think he's even leaving it up to the audience to decide, was it worth it? What do you think? He doesn't always answer it super clearly.
So, based on interviews and stuff, I think we can know that Whiplash came from a very personal place. Even La La Land, there was some personal stuff I think that he was kind of putting into that film. And he's even said in interviews, like, when I feel scared, like, I can't write this or all my friends will just say, "Oh, Damien, you just make movies about yourself." He's like, "That's when I know I should write it."
Mhm.
You know? I don't know if that's maintained, like, as much truth as he's made, like, First Man, and then he's made more stuff. But, like, shifting directions, like, I think of a film that you love, like Anna Karenina, for
Oh.
example. Joe Wright, he loves literature apparently and whatnot, but he really didn't come up with the idea. He's not a writer-director even. He didn't even write the script.
Yeah.
And it's an adaptation of a Leo Tolstoy novel. Leo Tolstoy is a male writing a story about a female experiencing the social repercussions of adultery. It's an interesting story, right? Like why, that film feels very authentic to me, feels very
Mhm.
honest, it's powerful. Its source material is remarkable and has had ripples through culture. So I guess my question is it the only way? Maybe it's a bad example because obviously that's not a resource filmmaking kind of film. In some ways it is, but for the sake of Feature Filmmaker Academy, it is not. It does not fit the definition of resource
Not gonna
filmmaking.
be your first film.
Yeah. It's a $30 million movie with A-list actors and incredible art design and cinematography, and it's out there. It's next level. It's beautiful. So I guess my question is like, what are the rules that can be broken, and what are the principles that must be followed? Like in your mind, how do you balance that? I guess the existence, I suppose, of films that are not necessarily autobiographical or even very personal, unless Leo Tolstoy experienced some side of something like that, which I know nothing about Leo Tolstoy's life, but let's just assume he didn't. And I think that that's just an okay assumption to make because we know that there are people that have made incredible films that maybe aren't like mining, like, they're not very close to that autobiographical side of that spectrum.
Mhm.
I guess what's your perspective on that?
I don't know. I guess I think of Anna Karenina as something that's almost a universal experience. It's hard for me to imagine him not being able to relate to, obviously, I mean, not all of us have had affairs, but this interplay or this comparison of love versus lust, or like how do love and lust interact, or do they? You have a relationship that is a marriage of convenience, a marriage of class, where there's some degree of love, but not really, and
Mm,
no lust. And then you have this relationship that is built on the foundation of lust and deception, contrasted with another relationship that is built on a foundation of love, and commitment and sacrifice. And I just think, I don't know, to me, that's like a theme that I am really interested in, is like true love and what that looks like and the consequences of lust
hmm.
and what the difference is.
It's interesting that you're like almost working backwards, like trying to use a story to break apart a thesis into its component parts, as if it was the synthesis and you're trying to find a thesis and antithesis out of that. Like, what is love? What is lust? And I say you because
Oh.
you're describing Tolstoy in that way, but I also know that you explore films this way, like you just described, and you're trying to define those things by throwing them into scenarios, and seeing like, how does love behave? How does lust behave? And how does Kitty and Constantine look?
Mm.
How do Anna and what's his name? Bronzewood, whatever. I'm stroking my mustache.
Remember?
And so that's an interesting idea that, and it is like a very theoretical way, but you don't watch the story and go, there's a bunch of theories in this movie. You're like, there's characters, right? They feel fleshed out and
Yeah.
very real. And that brings me to this idea of like misappropriation, which is a topic in storytelling, which we're all very worried about. Like, you can only tell like autobiographical stories, otherwise you're being like sexist or racist or stepping out of bounds in some way. And I'm wondering what your feelings are there, because we had professors on like opposite sides of that, and friends as well who have some writer friends in particularly who have kind of bounced around on different camps on that. Like, we need more female directors, or we need more directors in these minority, like, who can speak from the perspective of the minority
Mhm.
on a personal level, as opposed to like, and yet that's almost turned into, therefore you can't tell that story, otherwise it's misappropriation. And so I guess for you, like, what is misappropriation? Is it real? And if so, what what doesn't count as misappropriation, I guess? Like, for you, do you even think about that? Or
No, I think that's a good question. I don't really believe in telling people that they can't tell any story that they feel like they can tell, but I might not relate to it. I see lots of films with portrayals of mothers that I don't relate to. And it doesn't mean that no one relates to them. Maybe some people do, but a lot of times I watch them and feel like I don't think that this person either knows what it's like to be a mother or has had the same experience with parenthood as I've had, if any experience with parenthood. And so I think it can be very powerful to, if you're telling a story that's thematically related to a specific experience that you understand deeply, that can be really powerful to tell that story and to introduce people into that world in a way that maybe they have never experienced.
that's really interesting. We have a dear mentor and professor who lost his wife.
Mhm.
And I think it's really interesting because he could pick out disingenuous stuff, anything relating to that sort of an experience, a deep personal human loss of any kind, usually a death.
Mhm.
I remember there was a student piece that I had made that related to a man losing his wife and that moment of discovery. And I remember that was one of the things that he was like, his behavior in that moment, that shot right there, he goes, that's not how he would have behaved. And I think he came from it with some authority. And you might think, well, maybe a different person other than you would have behaved differently. But he was right, to be frank. Watching it on screen and going, okay, yeah, I mean, you could argue that maybe like another character could, but like this character, I think this professor understood this character better than I did, right? And I could see it. I could see what he was saying. It wasn't just that's what he would have done. It's almost a plausibility error, the specific way that he responded versus the realistic ways that someone would respond in that scenario, getting that news, on that day, it's like,
Yeah.
and it made sense to me. And he also said this about the movie Monster Calls, which it's not a big bash. It's actually really interesting. He said, I watched that film. I'm speaking, I guess, on behalf of him. He was basically saying that he'd watched the film and he expressed his feelings that, oh, this director clearly has never experienced a loss like this. That's a film about a young boy who's experiencing the slow decline and death of his mother from, I think, cancer. And he said it was very evident to me that the director had not experienced that. And just watching the movie, he could tell. And then he said, the later he listened to interviews from the director, and the book really did seem to take this angle of like a loss of faith in the boy and this sort of like difficult cynicism that was brewing in him because of this loss. And yet the movie touched on it, but it just didn't seem to quite capture it. And then he said that the director says in an interview basically that this film wasn't a film about loss. It was a coming of age story. That's how he took the film. That's how he directed it, right?
Yeah.
And he was like, oh, okay. So that's what it was interesting to him about this story. Like it wasn't even a film about loss for him. And yet it was a story literally about loss, right?
Yeah.
So is that misappropriation? Well, not really. It's just like approaching it differently, but it's true that like we as human beings come with our own affordances and limitations because of our own life perspectives. I
Yeah.
bring that up because of Tolstoy, right? He's a man, but he's
Right.
writing about a woman having an affair
Well,
in this society that's going to be very difficult for her.
and I actually think it's so good and healthy for us to try to make films and try to understand people who are different than us. And we have to accept that we might be wrong. We might not portray it perfectly. We might have errors or people might not relate to it. But I think that in we learn. We
Yeah.
learn about other people, and even where we fall short, we start to see and understand the people around us, which ultimately is a good result. That is a good discussion to be able to have or result to be able to obtain through filmmaking. I think filmmaking can be very charitable, and acting and, whatever way you're involved in filmmaking, being able to try to put yourself in someone else's shoes and relate to that person and understand them, even if you don't agree with them. Taking Anna Karenina again as an example, Anna is a character that I can relate to some degree, although I wouldn't make the choices that she had made. And I see the consequences of those choices and I don't envy her. But at the same time, I think it's good for me to be able to understand someone who might make that mistake and
hmm
experiences those difficulties. And it's a cautionary tale to a degree. At least that's my reading of it. So I just think I think
I'm not sure
misappropriation.
there's anyone who could read it and be like, this is a story. This is a book just about how great
Clearly,
it is
I
to
should
fall
go
in your
have an
heart and
affair.
be that terrible man that you're with.
No, I don't think it's trying to do that.
I mean, there might even be situations where someone might be able to tell that, but I just don't know how you could read that out of Anna Karenina.
Yeah, and there's been many versions of of that story, so maybe other
The
versions
the trailer of the
do it
Joe Wright
differently.
movie sure is that version that you're talking about. It's like the greatest love story ever told. It's like
Mismarketing,
who
yeah.
who marketed this film?
Yeah, I think misappropriation, in my mind, is when you're not coming from that place of trying to understand somebody, but you are trying to portray them. Like, if you're not doing it charitably, if you're not taking the time to do your research to really try to understand a person, or you're trying to do an expose, or you have some
Right,
sort
and
of
the research isn't just like
bias
a
or
box to
agenda,
check. The research is like because of genuine curiosity or even love for your subject material, right? Like
I
it's
think
like
you have to love your characters.
yeah,
Like, even if you don't agree with what they did, it just doesn't do them justice to try to tell their story from a place of seeing them as evil and ill-intended, and that's a kind of filmmaking that I don't love.
I think Mike Schur quoted someone. I can't remember who he quoted, but he's the creator of The Office. Well, he was one of the lead writers on The Office. He was creator of Parks and Rec and The Good Place. And we met him, and he at one point he said at a writers' conference at BYU, and he said he quoted someone, I believe. I don't think this was him speaking for himself, as saying, "If you don't love your characters, you have no business writing them."
Yeah.
Or maybe that was the director of Parks and Rec, not Parks and Rec. Sorry, I just said that, of Portlandia. He might have been the one to say that. But that was like a theme of that conference. Many of the guests at that conference, including Mike Schur, were talking about that absolute necessity that, like, if you don't have like a loving disposition towards these characters, like, they're not even going to be good characters.
Yeah.
It's like
Yeah.
there's really nothing there for you to do with them,
Well, and it's usually, I think, when you don't love the characters, it's coming from you're making this film with an agenda of some
which
sort,
kind of
which is
strips it of authenticity that we were talking about in the
that
first place.
humanity, yeah, and being able to relate. So that to me is what misappropriation is. I could tell a story about a male who's in a totally different situation than I am, totally different race than I am, whatever, and it could be deeply personal to me, and I could
Yeah.
relate to that person's experience or their way of viewing the world. And I think, I might mess up a little. I might not be perfect, but I would definitely try to understand those parts of that person's heritage or history or circumstances that I don't necessarily know. Yeah, I have some examples of films in my mind, that stories that I feel like I want to tell that I know I would need to do research on because
Yeah.
there are people who are different than me, different cultures, different upbringing, different religion, whatever.
But to me, that's like a portal that's an exciting one.
Yeah.
Like this idea of like I have a film that I've wanted to tell about like early colonization of Hawaii
Hmm.
and about Hawaiian culture and early Hawaiian martial law called kapu. And I remember that one I had some people like sort of college students kind of warn me like, "Oh, that might be misappropriation." Then I even had a professor that was like, "Just tell the dang story." Like, just and it's not like a just tell it lazily. I mean, this professor is a writer, and he would want nothing short of like extreme authenticity, like dig deep and research the bejeepers, not just research, but like develop the characters to the nth degree, right? Like don't settle for anything less than like immersion, you know? And it's not just for your sake or the movie's sake, but it is for the movie's sake. And you wouldn't be able to make the film without support from the people that you were portraying, you know? And then they would become the filmmakers themselves. And so it's like we act like the director or the writer are like the authors. And in a lot of ways, they are very principal authors of a film, and they're important authors of a film. And yet, Ron Howard just made a film about people in Taiwan called 13 Lives. Remarkable film that portrays Europeans. They are Anglo-Saxon white males. They're not Americans like Ron Howard is. And and yet the movie was produced by Thai people, and its majority cast is Thai, and almost none of the cast or even the characters are American. Like, and so there's a huge mix, but the story is kind of a mixed story, but it portrays all these things so charitably and respectfully. It's a deeply respectful film, and you can feel that on every level. Like, it has this respect for humanity, for human life, for all the different countries and cultures that were involved, all the different professions of the agricultural, farmer, rescue team, Navy SEAL, military, government. It just didn't look down on anyone. No one was the bad guy in that film. It was just this incredible movie that I think really disproves maybe a blanketed view of misappropriation. So I guess that's hopefully not a tangent, but for me, it's this permission to tell stories that feel resonant on a thematic level. Like you said, it doesn't matter what the subject matter is. If it's about a group of people that maybe you don't fit into in some way, which I think almost every story in some way detaches itself from you at some point, at least the characters will, unless it's literally autobiographical, then pull in people who are maybe closer to that and pull them into the movie, whether it's the actors or producers or whoever. And I think of Coco, right? It's made by an American company, and yet it was the highest grossing film of all time in Mexico because I think the Mexicans felt like the film did it respectfully and it was done right. It was done deeply charitably. And yet I am not Mexican. I do know Spanish and I have a lot of Mexican friends and I have a deep love for that culture. but I haven't even been to Mexico that very, very much in my life.
Mhm.
And yet that's one of the most emotionally impactful films I've ever seen. I'm just gonna say that without any shame. That like a Pixar movie that's aimed at 10-year-olds or even younger is one of my favorite films because it relates to me in ways that the filmmakers have no idea could relate to me.
Yeah.
It relates to me on a theological level as a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints about families, eternal families and the eternity or the eternal relationship or the eternal nature of those relationships, I mean to say. And I think it actually expresses it better than any film I've ever seen, ever, including all films made by people of my faith, right? Like, I don't think we've ever been able to express emotionally and narratively the importance and depth of that relationship, as well as that film, which is about what many Christians would call a pagan holiday, you know? And so I just think that's really actually, I think that's really cool. I think it's exciting and I think it's charitable. And there were a ton of Mexican and otherwise Latin American or Hispanic members of that team that made the film, but a lot of the lead players were probably white men and women, like not
Yeah.
even necessarily fluent in Spanish. And so,
Yeah, I think there are many examples of this where often even someone from an outside perspective can tell the story even better and appreciate it even more
hmm,
than someone who's inside of it. I think of a few examples come to mind. I think, well, one is Ford versus Ferrari, which I think is people who don't love cars, and it's a movie about cars. And the director was not someone who was super into car races,
but he didn't like NASCAR culture in general. He's like, I just don't like NASCAR that much,
which is interesting.
and I frankly don't even like 40s. That I would buy a Ferrari before I'd buy like the GT that they drive in the movie.
Yeah, but I think he did a great job making that story personal and interesting. And the other one that comes to mind is Pursuit of Happiness, which is a beautiful film about the American dream. And yet it was made by someone who was not an American,
And by
did not even
made,
speak
I mean
English,
directed.
directed, yeah.
Yeah,
And yet I think he captured the American dream,
I mean, he spoke English.
but not as his native language.
That's what you mean.
Yeah.
Okay, I was like, I'm pretty sure he spoke English.
And I actually think he was able to do that better because he was not an American, because he could see that from an outside perspective that appreciates it more than most of us do who
Mhm.
grow up in it.
And what's interesting is we're not Peachtree City locals, but we live in Peachtree City, Georgia,
Mhm.
which is like, did you guys ever see the movie Jaws? It's a little film made by a 27-year-old named Steven Spielberg. There's a great little line in there where they're talking about island life, and they're like, I think I've lived here for like 10 years, and I'm like, aren't I a local? And they're like, no, you're not a local unless you were born here. It's just all there is to it. I remember like, it's like a background conversation that like some extras are having or something, but it was intentional. I mean, you were meant to hear the conversation, but I just, that idea of like this tight sort of community that's like really special and everyone wants to feel like they're indigenous somehow, of that cool little beach town, but very few of them actually are. And so there's this kind of pride that exists. And I feel like we live in a place kind of like that. Like Peachtree City's got this pride, and most of us are transplants. Almost none of us really grew up here, although a lot of people here did grow up here, and a lot of people stay or come back after, college education, and they raise their families here because it's such a family place. So we were hired to make a commercial for Peachtree City, and we took it in a very narrative route. And I just think about how you mentioned earlier, like even projects that come to you, you judge it based on, can I bring a personal point of view to this in a way that I feel like I am injecting myself into it. There's like me that can breathe life into this thing, And and so when I got that, I was like, well, this is a place that I really love. And I'm coming from it from an immigrant perspective, so to speak, like I've never lived in Georgia at all, the state in my life. I hadn't even visited Georgia, I'd probably driven through it is all when I was like tiny. And so you bring a different perspective there, and that's necessarily not necessarily a bad thing, I guess. What you're saying is that that even comes with some
It can even
strengths.
be an advantage.
Yeah.
You look at young people who've grown up here, even our own children are starting to grow up here and just think, oh, all cities are this way. They take for granted what makes this city special because it's just all they've ever known.
It's like Woody Allen's Midnight in Paris, right? It's his love letter to a place that he loves, that he is in no way a citizen of. Actually, Woody Allen might have dual citizenship for all I know, but he's not indigenously French, right? He's just not. He's not French. He's American, and no matter what he wishes, that's just the fact. And yet, French people love movies that talk about how great France is, right? Like, especially if they're made from an outside perspective. Don't we all prefer conversion stories? Like, we Christians love stories about people who were like way on like the fringes of the most not Christian thing, and they become Christian. And you could say that about any religion, any country. We just love the stories of the people that come here. And, and in a lot of ways, America is a story of immigration. And we
Mhm.
love stories about that perspective of like people,
Falling in love with
yeah, making this their
place
home
or
or yeah.
yeah.
And so in some ways, I think that love thing comes back. It's not even just love for your characters that have flesh and blood, but like your either literally or proverbially, but also your subject matter on any level. Like if your subject matter is a country or a place or a religion or whatever, you can make films that try and tear things down or that appreciate the value and the goodness in whatever that thing is. Like
Mhm.
even native religions that most of us as Western people would consider to be superstitious, Ron Howard depicts them very charitably in the movie 13 Lives. And to the point where some Christians had issue with it because they're like, it shows idol worship or whatever. And it's like, it was respectfully showing some of the driving faith of people that have a different religion than most Western civilizations, right? And I thought it was respectful.
Yeah,
I
I
don't
think so
think it
too.
was trying to convert us to those religions.
No, it didn't have an agenda to
Right.
do anything, but it was loving and trying to understand and appreciate something that was different than Ron Howard's own convictions or
Whatever
whatever.
those are, yeah, I don't
Yeah.
even know. And isn't that interesting that like I think that sometimes because like we're people of faith, and I think that often people of faith in any degree or people of strong convictions who aren't even people of faith, whether those convictions are political or religious or just personal in some way, that when those convictions become an agenda in our film, it really ruins the film. It ruins the tone and the perspective or point of view of it. It ruins the authenticity of the entire experience, in my opinion. And I think when conversion is the goal, you really do sacrifice authenticity. And I think that's why people of faith often struggle to make authentic films. And I'm not saying that to be critical. I'm just saying it as like something I'm learning from what you said, Anna, that we often fear to tell stories about things that we don't believe in or that we don't even agree with in a respectful or accepting light because we think that that will then become the agenda. Like that will become the perspective of the film. But once again, like you can charitably portray a different religion or a different political standpoint or a different person, whatever in whatever way that difference manifests itself with deep respect and love. And you're not like advocating that person's lifestyle or religion
Mhm.
or I don't know, country of citizenship or like
It's a great example because some of the best Christian films are made by people who are not of the same religion as the ones portrayed in this film, if they're made with that intent of being charitable and understanding and appreciating what this person believed and what they were trying to do. Now, there are other films that are intentionally made to try to dissuade or present an agenda or a bias or a picture of evil or whatever
right. But
that are offensive, but
sacrifice authenticity too, I feel like. And I think that some people criticize bad political or religious filmmaking on one side of the aisle, but I've also seen it on both.
yeah.
I've seen kind of heavy-handed message films that lose a lot of authenticity because they lose sight of like the charity for the characters and for the perspectives of those characters. And we kind of, we turn our friend who we just had on the podcast, Barrett Berg, and I pitched a story to him and he said, I told him these characters and this and that and whatever. And he said, those aren't characters. Well, you just described our ideologies. And it like hit me like a ton of bricks. I was like, he's totally right. He was totally right. I had not really created a character that had like a life and a desire. I created a character that had a point of view and they basically just lived verbally based on that point of view. I could have made them black, white, male, female, uh, American, European, Asian. It wouldn't have mattered. they would have had the same ideology, and they would have said the same words. In other words, there was no flesh. There was just no reality or like circumstantiality or context to this character. They just were my words of that perspective, which is that's kind of misappropriation, right? It's like, well, if I had that incorrect perspective, I would say this. It's like it's not really a character.
Well, and it depends on what you're making. I think if you're in a fantasy realm, like you have a little more freedom to explore those kinds of things where a character could represent an idea or an archetype or something. But when it's, I think, especially if you're depicting actual events, actual people, actual religions or cultures, that's when you have to be really careful.
Well, but I mean, I'll even flip that. I think that the burden is almost higher when you're making fantasy because
Yeah.
you look at Tolkien and he wrote very few stories in comparison to a lot of novelists. I mean, like you like Gary Paulson. Gary Paulson wrote stories that he knew. He was very much into the wilderness. He was into survival. He was into coming of age about 14-year-old boys because he ran away from home at 14 and went to live with us in a circus and did all sorts of stuff. He put himself into those stories and he wrote over 100 novels.
Mhm.
Tolkien wrote like very few. Middle Earth pretty much was the main thing that he wrote ever. He didn't write that many books, to be frank, compared to most writers. And yet, I think that's because the burden on him was not just research, it was creation. And he had to create so much context to the world. He couldn't just go read a book about it. He had to write a book about it and then write a book that takes place inside the context of the book that he just wrote. Like he had to create what is a hobbit and then flesh out what that means. And then all the context of Hobbiton culturally and spiritually and mystically and mythologically, and you had to create the history and the everything. And
Yeah, I mean, it's freedom, but it's also more work.
well, but are those not archetypes? But are they not flesh and blood characters? I mean, they're totally fleshed out.
Yeah.
Some of the best character
And
writing
they're
ever.
also some of the best archetypal representations ever, in my
Yeah,
opinion.
they're almost the extremes of both, which makes them so powerful.
Yeah.
That's amazing. But it's kind of a pushback from what you said, like
Yeah.
as if there's an archetype and then there's like a realistic character. And I'm like, well, I think those are both.
I think you can achieve a realistic character from an archetype. You could start there. I don't think that's a problem to start there
Oh,
as
yeah.
long as you are willing to put in the work and time to develop it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's really fascinating. Well, to bring it all back, so we started off, and I think that I want to bring it back to this topic because I think it's valuable for our listeners, but I also think it's valuable for us to discuss is just we're talking about films that can be produced with whatever resources we have now, whether those resources are ourselves or people we know with significant amounts of money or just things we have access to, people, places, whatever. How, I guess I want to boil down some principles. Maybe each of us could take a turn of bringing ourselves into something.
Yeah. And also when you do it, would you explain to us the title of this podcast, what that means? Because I'm just curious. What is mining your life
Do
and
you want me to do
digging
that
up
now?
films? Just when you
Okay.
take your turn at some point.
So I guess you go first.
Oh.
What do you feel like you've learned so far about, maybe that's pretty much what we've just done this whole episode.
From this discussion, like summarize.
Well, from this discussion and also just from your experience as a filmmaker, as a person who's written a few scripts and made a few movies and is currently writing a few scripts, like what are some principles for approaching putting yourself into a project or into a film or into a story, really is into a story or into a character, whatever.
I think I've mostly just learned to be more open-minded about what kinds of stories could be personal to me. I think there are times in my life where I thought, oh, I could never make a Marvel movie. I could never make, like, there's certain kinds of movies that I would never make. I would never make a horror thriller movie, stuff like that. And I think I've become more open-minded to say, maybe I could, maybe I could make it personal. Maybe there is something personal I can pull from a lot more films than I would initially expect. And so I've read a lot of scripts from friends who write different kinds of stories than I do. And as I talk to them about the themes and what they're expressing, or even people in the Feature Filmmaker Academy. A lot of people in that academy are making films that are not films I would have ever chosen to make, and yet as we mentor them through their process of developing the film, I come to see why it's personal to them and what they're doing with these characters and these stories, and that's been a really enjoyable experience, I think.
Yeah.
So I think, yeah, I've become more open-minded to consider what I could make personal.
That's really cool. I've noticed that in you as well. I think that at first when we were in school, I feel like your general feeling was like that you'd have to write all the movies you directed because I seem to remember this being your general feeling or leaning, I should say. And then I started to see that, and I've always kind of had the opposite feeling, which is like Spielberg didn't write hardly any of the movies he directed, and I'd be happy if like if people brought anything. Like, my goal is to be able to make anything that someone brings to me personal. And yet you've actually had more written and given to you, like I wrote the first draft of The Loved and Lost, and I wrote the first draft of Ready or Not, and there were other projects that some haven't materialized, but they were completely written by someone else, and they were deeply personal to you. And so I think it's interesting that you've been able to extend that. And I've pretty much written everything. I feel like I haven't really had anyone like hand me a script, and I'm like, oh yeah, great. I'd love to still do that. But something that comes to my mind is Paul Schrader talks about how to make a spark, out of a positive and negative charge. You have two wires, and he said you have a metaphor, and there's the reality or like the literal, which is like basically autobiography, right? It's like it's you, it's your life, it's your personality. And then there's like the metaphor, which is basically the movie you're making and the story that you're fabricating, the made up, make believe stuff. And he said they have to be, and this is his approach, close enough that there's a spark. If they're touching, in other words, they intersect, they're like the same thing.
Mhm.
At that point, you're just completely making autobiography. He said at that point, it's very hard to be completely honest and authentic because we don't really want to be that authentic and honest usually. And once again, this is his approach for himself. He's like, I can't just tell the truth about myself in every single regard and explore the themes and the characters and everything freely. But if it's too far apart, if it's super far separated, there's no metaphor, right? It's like, yeah, or there's no authenticity at all because it's so far removed from the story that you're telling. You are so detached from the story you're telling. He says when the distance is just right, it's just make believe enough that you can freely explore it and be honest about, well, this is what the character would do, and this is what
Yep.
would happen, and this is how we just let the story tell itself. But there's enough of you in it that it's like, and I can speak from some position of understanding, and boy, this last script that I've been working on that I've got about 20 pages into, I can't even tell you how much just conceptual development had to go into starting to be able to even write it before I felt like that distance, the spark hit. I'd put just enough of myself, and not just myself, but my own theological beliefs,
Mhm.
which was a big part of this particular story, into it. But then I just couldn't tell it if it was truly exactly the theological, like if I was like, I'm just going to go straight up, you know, pull it out of the scriptures kind of thing. And because I don't know why I couldn't do it. The story just didn't go anywhere. It just couldn't breathe. And then I separated it enough that it was basically a fantasy film. It wasn't really a religious film of any existent religion. And yet, if you watched it and you were like, if you shared my religious convictions, you'd watch it and probably go, well, this was obviously made by a person who's a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Like, you know what I mean? And they'd see it, but most people would watch it and just go, this is a really interesting fantasy film. And it's not like Battlestar Galactica or anything where they're like, there's like a council of the 12 or anything. They're like really on the nose or whatever. It's like, hopefully not. But it's like, it just metaphorically kind of works in the same way, but yet it's detached enough that it's like, none of us would be like, oh yeah, I believe all those things. No, it's make believe. It's fake. It's fantasy. But just the same as like J.R. Tolkien was Catholic. He didn't believe in elves, right? Like it's like,
Yeah.
and it like, it opened it up enough for me that I felt like I could be authentic, but I could also, you know, I could step out of it enough so that I could feel like I could lead it. It wasn't just like me
Yeah,
looking at
sometimes
myself in the mirror.
I think sometimes it's easier to be real and authentic when the story is removed from yourself enough
Right.
because I think about
That's the French man in making The Pursuit of Happiness. That's the American making Midnight in Paris, right? It's like,
yeah, we're coming back around to that again, and I think it's also just you don't have to be so self-conscious when it's not about you, so it lets you be honest. It's like when you're acting, I remember doing acting classes and we do a neutral mask exercise where everyone puts on this mask that's just like a neutral face, and it's so much easier to be honest and, like, expressive when no one can see your face because you can't really be self-conscious. You feel like there's this freedom to express and you're not yourself. No one's It's really hard to explain if you haven't tried it, but it's this idea that when you're hiding yourself, you can be more honest. You feel like when you're in a story that's clearly not you, that's so separated from
hmm,
yourself, that there you can really honestly explore something and not have to be self-conscious that, oh, what's everyone going to think
yeah.
about my face or about my religion or about whatever I'm telling the story about.
Ryan Gosling talked about the power of costume in that
Yeah.
same way, where he talked about like watching his uncle bedazzle a suit. He was like an Elvis impersonator, and like when he put that on, it almost gave him this power or this like release from I am now portraying an idea, like this sort of
Yeah, it's so
characterization of
strange, but
Elvis.
it's so powerful. I was just on a set that was a '60s film, and everyone was wearing '60s clothing,
It's
and
like
it was
Halloween costumes, yeah.
well, but it was incredible. It wasn't I mean,
No, I mean like it has the same effect as like a
oh,
Halloween costume where you're
I
like,
don't know. I've
wow.
never felt that with a Halloween costume, but I'm not really a big Halloween person, but,
Yeah, you haven't truly experienced Halloween. I'm kidding.
but wearing this '60s outfit with a bunch of other people wearing the same kind of clothing, it was amazing how easily I felt like I was a different character, and I felt myself acting kind of differently because I was dressed differently. It's strange, but yeah. I think with storytelling, you wanna make something personal, but it's okay if it's removed from your own personal life and in a way that can really help you explore and understand other people, be really honest and sincere, and still not have it be too close to home in a way that's doesn't let you be honest because you're afraid. It's hard to explain, but
Well, and everyone's gonna be a little different because I've seen some people make stuff that is really deeply personal and
yeah.
they're really good at it.
Mhm.
Like it's a lot closer. Like for them, the spark is a much shorter distance, you know, than for me. And for others, it's like even bigger. It's like I'm not writing a high fantasy like Tolkien. Like I have not done as much world building as he has. Like not even close. And and for him, at that huge distance, like I don't think anyone who in the Lord of the Rings is J.R. Tolkien, like who represents him. It's like there's no like, oh yeah, that's clearly like there's the autobiographical portion. It's we all see little things. We're like, oh, there's maybe like a little bit of Catholicness in
You
it.
say that.
Oh yeah, like, we think like, oh, there's maybe a little bit of Catholicness, or maybe there's a little bit of like his World War I experience or whatever. But none of us are like, oh, it's Bilbo. It's definitely him. Like he is Tolkien. It's like, you know what I mean? But yeah, and yet with a lot of filmmakers, even with Schrader, he's like, Taxi Driver was like, what if I put myself, I basically was like, as a 20-year-old, if I were to put myself in a taxi and just kind of go down this road that I was going down in my life, and I could just see like all the destruction that I could experience going down that road without actually going down that road. And so he writes it all into the script, right? And so for him, it was almost this like, I'm going to explore my future in like this unleashed sort of way.
Mhm.
And metaphorically, he could do all of that, live that life through the film, and then like walk away from it almost. And it's like for him, maybe there was a little bit more of a personification that was like, or maybe even like a clone or like a surrogate
Yeah.
for himself in that story that was more direct. And so I guess for me, these principles, there's no like strict, you must do it one way or the other,
Mhm.
especially with resource filmmaking. Some people might have the resource of they can set up green screens and they are super good at rotoscoping and chroma key and they could tell a sci-fi movie on like no money. And there are people out there, it's like they just take their time and they shoot it all in their basement. And even Peter Jackson said people are going to make movies like this in 20 years out of their basements. And there are people making films that have as good of VFX in some aspects as The Lord of the Rings had in the year 2001 now in their basements. And some of us don't have those skills. So maybe our skills are different or our resources are different. So I guess my point is like there's no genre. I might read a script and go, that's not producible. And someone could say, oh yeah. And they'd go make it, and I mean, heck, people have been making stop motion movies out of their basements
Yeah.
for a long time,
Well, and your skills are a resource too with resource filmmaking.
Yeah.
Resource filmmaking does not mean you have to be telling an autobiographical film.
Yeah.
But some people can and do very well, like you said. I just think it's harder. I think almost wonder if it's related to how it's harder to love ourselves than to love other people. I think it would be easier for me to make a film about a Catholic than a film about a member of my own church or a film about someone else than a film about myself because it's easier for me to love people with all their flaws when they aren't me. And sometimes when it's
Yeah.
me, it's like I don't forgive myself as easily.
Or even I can't show myself charitably or it feels indulgent or people will
Yeah, it
think
feels vain
or
or
people will think I'm vain. Yeah, exactly. And yet, like, I don't think that's actually true.
yeah.
That's a tricky one. I think that it's the elusive quality of true self-confidence, which isn't arrogance, but it's not self-deprecation.
Mhm.
It's true confidence, which is a synthesis, right? It's neither of the two things. It's actually higher than either of them. In this case, they're both kind of negatives, right? And sometimes we think that self-deprecation is humility, which it's not. And sometimes we think that arrogance is confidence, which it's not. Humility is transcendent of both of those, and confidence, I think, is transcendent of both of those. So, in some ways, our virtues or developing our characters, it, it behooves us to be charitable with ourselves and to develop those attributes because it helps us to be able to tell great stories. That makes me think of the summer we marathoned Miyazaki films. And I remember watching those and thinking, it finally hit me this concept that Dean Duncan, one of my professors, said about charitable filmmaking. It hit me one day. I was like, oh, Miyazaki makes charitable films, meaning films that have this perspective of love in general. They're just lovingly made, but they also have this perspective of love toward their characters almost across the board and their subject matter as well.
And it doesn't mean he doesn't show their flaws.
Yeah, he's really good at it. And I wonder like how does he do it? What is the craft? What are the buttons I have to push to get charity into my movies? It sounds silly, right? And I watched those and I was like, Miyazaki makes charitable films because he's a charitable person. I realized it because he was giving an interview talking about Chihiro, the protagonist of Spirited Away, and he said, I wanted to make a film about one of those kind of obnoxious 10-year-olds because those are my favorite kind of 10-year-olds. And I thought, they're not my favorite kind of 10-year-olds. In fact, I dislike them greatly. And he thought they were obnoxious, but that made them endearing.
Yeah.
And that means he loved them more. And so he could tell that story about Chihiro because he loved her. And he loved watching her be obnoxious and complain and then grow and then become greater. But that greaterness didn't mean that she wasn't as complete as she was at the beginning of the movie. And she was a complete person at the beginning of the movie, even though she changed and grew into a more sort of joyous and whole person at the end. And I feel like, or maybe not even just complete, but like worthy, And so I just feel like he can put himself into every film because his perspective is himself. And if we can't love our characters and love our subject material or even grow and develop these characteristics, we're cutting out the stories that we from our hearts and our minds. It reminds me of like the scripture, the light comprehends the darkness, but the light shineth in darkness and the darkness comprehends it not. It's like we can't actually be honest about all the human characters and all of the expressions of humanity if we're not charitable people. And that's why we get these movies where we hate certain characters, or we're supposed to think poorly of or root for the destruction of specific characters. And I don't know. I think that for the most part, that doesn't really work. I do believe in showing evil or even bad guys or villains, that can be great and have a time and a place. But, and there can be some archetypal reasons for that are liturgically sound, in my opinion. But the expose approach to filmmaking of like, I'm going to expose these bad guys, or I'm just going to show everyone how bad this person is, or whatever, or this perspective, or these people, or whatever, it falls flat and it ages poorly because it's just not true. And so it
It
really,
can be, but I mean, I think about the Elvis movie that just came out. That's kind of an expose that works.
well, on some degree, but I mean, this is just an opinion thing that we're going to get into.
What's his name?
Tom Hanks.
Well, Tom Hanks plays the character.
Colonel Parker.
Yeah. Colonel Parker is like a bad guy, but you also kind of like him and you understand his reasons.
I don't think that everyone likes him in that movie. I mean,
Well,
he's
there's
kind of charming because
like,
he's played by Tom Hanks, and you're kind of like, he's got this kind of funny accent, and he kind of does a few funny things every now and then. But for the most part, I feel like he's just despicable. He's like the devil in that movie.
yeah, like he's
I
a
think
pretty evil character, but
I say that not
there's
as my
still
own
times
opinion. I say that I think that that's the director's perspective.
we think no less of Elvis for having a friendship with him and a relationship with him. And I
It's a very
think
toxic one, yeah, but he's kind of tricked almost, or, you know, beguiled by him.
he's a complex enough character, I think, that he doesn't just feel like straight up bad guy. It's like, yeah, this is a guy who like has vision, he has charisma, he has ideas that will work, but he also has addictions that he's feeding and he's using
And he has ideas that do not work, and he's, yeah.
and trying to cover up.
And
But
he
like,
has a very flawed ethical base.
anyway, sorry, this is a tangent. We should really wrap up this episode because
That's
it's
fine.
pretty long. But
Well,
tell us what the title means.
oh, so mining your life. Yeah, mine your life, dig up films, or mining your life, digging up films. Mine your life, dig up films. It's this idea that, like, you know, pour yourself into something and channel yourself into something, or go deep and explore yourself and learn about yourself. And I think that there's tons of stories within you, either because of the books you've read, or the life you've lived, or the perspectives you have, or the people you know. I guess all of that is part of you. And so I for me, the title is just, it's about, even if it's something like a script that's handed to you, or someone wrote a script, or you co-wrote it with someone, I still think even if you're acting in a film, you know, you have to bring a personal risk to the table, where you have to show some of yourself in the process of creativity in any position on a film, or in any art form in general, or in any relationship, in this case between a filmmaker and their audience. But even in our relationships, right, there's always this, like, I have to show my true self. And really, that's, I think, the trick of life is trying to get better at showing our true selves. And however we want to do that, we've talked about lots of ways to do that. I think the point is that we feel very personal as we're making and telling these stories.
Yeah, I love that. So it's kind of an if then. If you mine your life, you dig up great stories and film ideas. I kind of saw it as like two separate things that you were going to talk about, like mining your life and digging up. I imagined films that already existed, like,
Oh, interesting.
and pulling from them. But I understand now how those are connected. Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, with that on the nose ending, we have hopefully over-explained all the poetry out of our perspectives. We will leave you. And thank you for joining us on this exploratory conversation.
Until next time. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for joining us today. If you like what you're hearing on the podcast, you'll love the Feature Filmmaker Academy, a program designed to teach anyone how to finance and finish a feature film.
There are many resources teaching you how to do a great job, but what they don't teach you is how to get the job in the first place.
You cannot have a career making feature films until you've made at least one. Anyone can make a feature film using our proven model.
It's risk-free. If you follow all the steps in the program, you'll finance and finish a feature film, or we'll give you your money back.
Learn more at invisiblemansion.com/feature filmmaker or click the link in the show notes.
If you find this free resource valuable, we'd really appreciate it if you leave us a review or share it with another filmmaker. We'll see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.